Yes, that's the at Knockham Hill, the original site of the town of Swansea. The Bicknell Monument says that the First Baptist Church in Massachusetts was established near there. That site is now in Rhode Island, which makes everything a little more interesting. This is what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to fit some 20 pages into 20 minutes. So we'll go as fast as we can. I'm going to read some, I'm going to summarize some. I may comment a little bit, and then I think there's time for questions at the end. As was previously stated, I came in 2001 to the First Baptist Church. This is our 1848 meeting house, our fourth meeting house. The plaque is from our 300th anniversary in 1963. I came and I discovered that the original pastor of this church has mostly been forgotten. Has anybody ever heard of John Miles? I went to school with him. So anyway, I began to investigate this person, and I discovered that in the 17th century, he was right in the middle of the mix for the establishment of those things which we later called Baptists. So I began to do some research back then, and this paper is mostly the result of about 18 years of obsession. In 1767, James Manning, first president of Brown University, wrote in a circular letter for the Warren Baptist Association using the image of golden candlesticks to describe the Son of Man's churches. This was 118 years after John Miles utilized the same image in expressing his hope for the nascent Baptist movement in Wales. Manning's use of the image is consistent within the Welsh-Irish tradition, which shaped the first Philadelphia Association and then generated the Warren Association, this most influential tradition that at its beginning in Wales was guided by John Miles. Like a candlestick that's put in a closet, a significant figure that is left to the dusty closets of history will not be able to give us new insight or new understanding of who we are. John Miles was an early participant in the religious and political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic. Original questions, what it meant to be a Baptist, in quotation marks there, because they didn't call anybody Baptist until much later, were addressed to him in letters from Ireland, London, and various places within Wales. In the colonies, Miles provided a learned leadership that allowed three congregations, Boston, Newport, and Swansea, of the original colonial Baptist communities to cooperate. Institutions that Miles began, that is the town of Swansea, the Baptist Church in Warren, have evolved over the years, and from which other important institutions have emerged, continue to be effective, and continue to persist, and continue to influence the larger world as they advance the effort to hold forth right and true. Henry Melville King, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Providence, wrote in 1905, "The strong personality of the founder of the local church often leaves its impress on the spiritual body, which he nourishes into being and fosters during the period of its infancy. Roger Williams, John Clark, and John Miles were founders of churches which have lived until now, have influenced in no small way the measure of thought and life of their communities, and indeed the life and the institutions of the whole nations." What we have done recently is provided new research into the history of our congregation. You'll see there are three images. On the left is the original covenant, 1663, the oldest copy we have, which is in the Ilston book brought from Wales by Miles when he was excluded from England. That's our publication. I want to thank Dr. Brackney, who was our inspiration and helper in getting that all published. This paper is an exploration of the often unrecognized impress of John Miles. The history and heritage of any significant individual is not always written in paper, evident in many writings, but is discovered embodied in the institutions created and influenced by that person. As we place him and his ideas at important points within the discourse on being a Baptist, and as we trace these generative ideas through almost 4 centuries of Baptist institutions, we will see both the impress and the significance of this almost forgotten man. John Miles emerged as an early leader of the separatist particular Baptist movement in 1649. That was the year in which the tumultuous English Revolution climaxed in the execution of Charles I. This regicide was perpetrated by those who then followed Oliver Cromwell into his protectorate. This regicide was abetted by prominent Baptists like Henry Vane and Thomas Harrison, a correspondent with John Miles and his congregations. This places Miles within the mix of religious and political action from 1649 until he leaves England in or near 1662. I want to talk about him in England first. John Miles left Wales in January of 1649, just after the death of Charles I. He journeyed with Thomas Proud to London to meet with the leaders of the Glasshouse congregation on Broad Street. This is the Agus map. I want to thank Charlotte Carrington Farmer for pointing us to this resource. Broad Street is in the blue box in the bottom. Other early Baptist congregations were in Southwark, which is the pink at the bottom, and in Spitalsfield, which is the blue square up the top. Over on the left, you'd see Smithfield, where Roger Williams, about 30 years earlier, was hanging around there. The congregation was associated with many notable early Baptist leaders, including William Kiffin. This congregation stood in the line of the Puritan separatists and independents originating in the Leiden community of John Robinson, and followed by leaders such as Henry Jacobs, John Lathrop, Henry Jesse, and later John Spilsbury. The Glasshouse was one of the 7 London congregations that issued the 1644 Confession, the first in a series of Calvinistic public expressions of thought and practice. It was with and through this congregation that Miles engaged in a pattern of correspondence that reached from Wales through London to groups in Ireland and Scotland. Through the discourse of these letters, they developed a shared clarity and agreement about critical issues. This movement-wide correspondence provides insight into Miles' contributions to the early discourse. There are 14 letters collected in the Ilston book. Dated from 1650 through 1656, they are addressed to the Glasshouse congregation, various meetings in Wales, and to congregations in London, Ireland, and Scotland. Included in these letters are discussions about baptism, anti-pedo-Baptist, obviously, mixed communion, interchurch relationships, qualified leadership, and mutual encouragement. As a set, these letters exemplify a critical and influential discourse that took place as Baptists, again in quotes, developed their self-understanding. John Miles was sought after to be a contributing voice to these generative exchanges. And as signatures indicate, he was speaking with many significant leaders in the Baptist movement, such as Vavasor Powell, William Kiffin, Thomas Patience, Thomas Harrison, William Consett, and others. Miles coordinated both communications and the development of local congregational structures and practices, a major accomplishment in turbulent times. Miles' church planting skills developed here were later used in as he began work in New England. I want to, didn't get it there. Particular of interest in this book, these are 4 more pictures of our original records, are 2 issues found in this section: public preaching and mixed and open communion. For Miles, public preaching was critical in 2 ways. First, it was public, that is, not hidden from the oppressive authorities. The emphasis on public witness pervades Miles' written records. Being public in the 17th century was a challenge, socially and politically. Holding that the church must be a visible body of believers, Miles thrust his congregations into public and political discourse, and in doing so it was important that the preacher was accurate and authorized in their messages. I'm going to skip down a little bit. The open and mixed communion was off and on. There was closed there, open here, closed later. We can talk about that if we want later. Miles helped his young congregation in solving their pressing problems. In rereading these records, an image of Miles as a central founding agent and theologian begins to emerge. He was a man laying a solid organizational foundation, both structure and process, for the Churches of Christ in Wales. And thus he becomes a part of the Welsh Baptist and Welsh-Irish Baptist tradition. I'm going to get to William Kiffin. Oops. Okay, William Kiffin, on the left there, was also associated with Glasshouse Church. It stands out as particularly interesting within the context of religious and political turmoil of the English Civil Wars. His institutional connections to Miles put Miles within the matrix of religious and political movements. No, other way there. There we go. The Agus map again, with the Broad Street ward in blue. Just to the left of it is the Coleman Street ward. Kiffin is described by John Donahue as an important and moderating political influence, as Kiffin was involved with both the religious and political changes of the time. A wealthy merchant, Kiffin worked with others like Thomas Harrison and Patience, and they were involved in the rebellion against Charles I. Kiffin was one of the coordinating leaders and in communication with Baptists on both sides of the Atlantic after 1662. He was one of the early signatories of the confessions, including the influential 1689 confession that became the connection to the New England Baptists as they adopted that confession. His connection, okay, Miles in colonial New England. By locating Miles on the map of his associated relationships in New England, we can begin to trace a possible path from Wales to Rehoboth, where he appeared in 1662 or 3. By what means Miles arrived in Plymouth Colony has not been fully documented. Robert Anderson raises the question about when Miles arrived, but does not speculate as to by what route. This task he leaves to others, and I've speculated a lot. There is a, the map begins with a note in a Roger Williams letter to John Winthrop, which places John Clark on the left there, and Mark Lucar in Seacombe, then a part of Rehoboth, before December 1649. These two brought the practice of baptism by immersion from the particular Baptists in London with whom Lucar had been associated to the congregation in Newport. Williams' note indicated they were in communication about the issue of immersion with those in Seacombe. Those were members of the Newman Congregational Church in Rehoboth, 1642. One of them was Obadiah Holmes, who is being imaged here as being whipped in the Boston Common, a very famous event. This intersection of people would have been about the time of the execution of Charles I, and just before Clark returned to London with Roger Williams to seek a charter for the Rhode Island colony. Obadiah Holmes, famous for the 1651 whipping he received in Boston, held the eldership in Newport while Clark was in London. We'll skip a little bit here. We begin to see the connections at Clark and Holmes and the Swansea Proto-Baptists. Immediately after this intersection, Clark was living and working with the Baptists in London, according to Donahue. We also know that the Glass House wrote to the Newport congregation after Holmes was whipped to encourage support there. Miles had a long relationship with the Glass House Church, and communication to their leadership, which he had to flee in England, would seem logical that Rehoboth in Plymouth County would provide a home for him. Okay. Such a supportive community was to be found in Rehoboth, the town of which Clark and Holmes were familiar. Leadership in this proto-Baptist community would have included James Brown, an assistant governor. He was supported by a congregational ally, Captain Thomas Willett, a transatlantic merchant and assistant governor. These are the two men with whom Miles established the town of Swansea. It can be cautiously asserted that Miles escaped persecution in England because of his critical associations with other significant Baptists and revolutionaries and politicians both in England and in the colonies. Okay. The 1663 Covenant gathered us as a church in about 1663 there at Knockham Hill, which is at the top part of a 100-acre cove. The site now has been preserved by the Barrington Preservation people for perpetuity. Miles lived in one of the most conflicted moments in Anglo-American church history. This cautionary admonishment that we should not be in conflict with each other reflects his experience of the Civil War in England. He had seen the awful consequences of religious conflict and intolerance. I go on for a couple of pages here for about openness, ecumenical relationships, and the possibility of continuing revelation. Those are all kind of theological and less historical. While the organizing covenant allowed for the institution of the congregation, moving from the formation of the congregation to the formation of the town required more effort. This required some accommodation for the various religious opinions within that community and the developing governmental structure. As the town was formed, a second covenant or agreement was written by John Butterworth and Miles, addressed to Thomas Willett, and agreed on by the town. This second document clarifies many of the religious and political relationships to allow accommodation and to prevent conflict. One of those new options was baptism. This is one of the more interesting factors in our history, that the minister, and this is from the town covenant relationship, but the minister or ministers of the town may take their liberty to baptize infants or grown persons as the Lord shall persuade their consciences. And so also the inhabitants of the town to take their liberty to bring their children to baptism or to forbear. This was a real differentiation between the Proto-Baptists and the Congregationalists. But it describes a toleration that was more akin to that espoused by philosophers like John Locke and the radical position of Roger Williams, Miles' neighbor only 8 miles to the west. This type of toleration emerged from the more moderate political positions of independents and particular Baptists like William Kiffin, with whom Miles was associated. As organized by John Miles, the Church of Christ in Swansea was an established church, anathema for later Baptists. In the political sense, Miles died in 1683, the same year that Roger Williams did. In 1685, the town chose Samuel Luther as elder. Not a university graduate, Luther was mentored by Miles to be the pastor of the town and church. And then I'm going to skip. Okay, that's a picture of the Newman Congregational Church as it is now. The bottom is the Garrison House where the King Philip War began, right in front of Mr. Miles's house. And that was our third meeting house. The first one was burned in the war. The controversy here that I just want to hold up, because it really refers to the original agreement that was made in 1667 between Butterworth and Willett and Miles. But as the native people were removed from the areas below the Swansea village, other English moved in, and they wanted a Orthodox Puritan minister because Luther had no university training. In fact, in our records, he only signs his name with an X. Eventually, the Massachusetts Bay granted the request, and another town was formed in 1717. It's now Barrington, Rhode Island. But this was the Swansea response and said, hey, you know, you guys can form your own church if you would like. Actually, by 1680, there was another congregation, another Baptist congregation in Swansea that was active and has changed denominations, but as an organization, it's still there. The King Philip War. Probably the interesting thing about King Philip War, besides they burned the first Baptist meeting house in the New World, was that John Miles went to Boston and was there involved with the Baptists, Proto-Baptists, and was offered the position of elder, but he came back to Swansea because they offered him 200 acres, rebuilt his house. There was no political pushback in Swansea like there was in Boston, because at that point it was still Plymouth colony. Well, most historians identify Miles as an early Baptist figure. Most of them miss an essential point that undergirds his significance. Miles began institutions in the 17th century that continue, and that begat other institutions that continue to be vital into the 21st century. These include our own congregation, the town of Swansea, the Baptist churches in Warren and Bellingham, and not to be excluded from this list is Brown University. Flipping through this here, folks. The College of Rhode Island, now Brown University, was one product of the intellectual needs of those called Baptists, particularly the particular Baptists. The general Baptist kind of didn't have so much of a value for it. But the Baptist Church in Warren was created by the Philadelphia Association, who sent James Manning up to be its first pastor in 1742. There were some people who came to the Swansea congregation and asked to be sent out as a separate congregation. That happened in 1764 as they called James Manning to be their pastor. Soon after that, we had the formation of the College of Rhode Island, later Brown University, and then the Warren Association became influential in, through all of this, in the fight against established religions. John Leland was born and baptized in the Bellingham congregation, a daughter church of the Swansea Church. But following the Warren Association, Manning and Isaac Backus were the ones who were principal agents as we moved towards the disestablishment in 1833. Yeah. So, okay. I have one concluding paragraph, and then we'll open it for questions. One last question to ponder. What might be learned from Miles about the long-term persistence of an institution? First Baptist Church in Swansea continues from 1663. The congregation has survived wars, recessions, changes of government, depressions, and hurricanes. It has had 46 pastors. I was 44th. The town of Swansea continues to the present from 1667. The Bellingham Church continues from 1737. The Baptist Church in Warren and Brown University continue from 1764. These ecclesiastical, governmental, and educational institutions continue to serve and influence their communities. Organizations created to be a conduit for foundational ideas, maintain their vitality across centuries. In the historical context of conflict and emerging ideas, these institutions were consistent with their founding principles, adaptable to new conditions and open to a variety of leaders. Miles and his contemporaries reclaimed the primitive order of the church and with faith and intellect founded institutions that were significant at their beginnings and continue to be significant to their relevance to contemporary challenges to the Christian faith and to our political lives as citizens in the 21st century. Thank you.